The courtroom fell silent when Richard Sterling smiled at me, as if my future had already been decided. He had chosen the courtroom the way he chose everything, as a stage. His attorneys occupied one table like a wall of navy suits. His mother sat behind him with her pearls and her permanent look of disappointed royalty. Reporters waited outside, because Richard had wanted witnesses to my defeat. He thought shame worked best when it had an audience. I sat at the petitioner's table, 8 months pregnant, with swollen ankles, an empty ring finger, and a heart that had learned not to tremble in front of him. Across the room, my billionaire husband leaned back beside his expensive attorneys, dressed in a perfect charcoal suit, looking calm, polished, and cruelly certain. Behind him sat Sloane Kensington, his young mistress, dressed in winter, white silk and wearing my grandmother's sapphire earrings. The earrings were the first thing I saw. Not Richard's suit, not the cameras outside the courtroom. Those earrings. My grandmother had worn them to church, to funerals, and once to my college graduation, because she said every woman needed one beautiful thing no one could take by accident. Sloane touched them while she smiled at me, and I understood she had been told exactly where they came from. "Don't look so scared, Caroline," Richard said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "This will be painless once you accept that you have no leverage." My attorney, Miriam Vance, gently touched my wrist under the table. A warning. Stay calm, so I did. Calm was work. My back ached, my son pressed hard beneath my ribs. And every time Sloane's earrings caught the light, I felt my grandmother's memory, pulled into the room like another witness. I breathed through it because Richard knew how to use visible pain. I would not give him one more tool. Richard believed my silence meant defeat. For 6 years, he had called me graceful, lucky, manageable. His family had treated me like decoration. His friends saw me as a woman who should be grateful just to stand beside him. But Richard forgot something important. Before I became his wife, I had been a forensic accountant. Numbers had been my refuge long before Richard. In numbers, a lie could dress itself in expensive language, but it still had to balance. Money leaves fingerprints. People who believe they are too powerful to be questioned usually become the easiest to trace because they stop imagining anyone will look closely. Richard had taught me his world. Then he forgot I knew how to audit it. I met Richard during an investigation into a supplier that had been billing sterling capital for equipment that did not exist. He entered the conference room expecting to intimidate a junior accountant and found me surrounded by 6 years of invoices. I showed him where the money had gone. He fired 2 executives before lunch and asked me to dinner before sunset. Back then, he admired that I could see patterns other people missed. He said everyone around him wanted access to his name, while I seemed interested only in whether his numbers reconciled. I mistook being useful to a powerful man for being respected by him. The Sterling family required a prenup. I expected that. What surprised me was Richard's grandfather Edmund, who asked to meet me alone before I signed it. He was 86, sharp-eyed, and deeply unimpressed by inherited confidence. Edmund asked me questions Richard never had. What work made me proud? Which mistake had taught me the most? Whether I understood that marrying into money could make people kinder to my face and less honest behind my back. I left that meeting unsettled, but grateful. He was the first Sterling who spoke to me as if I might need protection from the family, not introduction to it. "A fortune teaches men to confuse being obeyed with being right," he told me. "Read every page, Caroline. Especially the pages Richard does not." Article 12 had been Edmund's creation. Richard's father had hidden a second household for years, draining company money while his wife was left financially trapped. The clause was designed to ensure no future Sterling heir could use the family machinery the same way. Edmund told me the old scandal had nearly killed Richard's mother, though she later turned that bitterness outward instead of upward. He said rich families do not always bury their crimes. Sometimes they endow them, rename them, and teach the next generation to call them tradition. Article 12 was his attempt to place one locked door inside a house built for men who believed every door opened for them. Richard mocked it during signing. He called it his grandfather's morality theater and said it would never matter to us. I watched him initial the page. 6 years later, He counted on me remembering my wedding vows and forgetting the contract beneath them. His lead attorney stood and told the judge the matter was simple. The prenup was airtight. I would leave with $100,000 and the belongings I had brought into the marriage. Nothing more. Sloane laughed softly from the gallery. It was a tiny sound, barely more than breath, but I heard it. So did the clerk. So did Miriam. Sloane thought she was watching the final scene of my humiliation. She did not know the earrings on her ears had already been logged as evidence, photographed, and matched to the safe inventory Richard claimed no one had touched. Then Miriam stood. "We have a response, Your Honor," she said calmly. "Before this court enforces the prenuptial agreement, we ask to address a condition Mr. Sterling seems to have forgotten." Richard's smile disappeared. 3 months earlier, I had discovered the truth. My pregnancy had not softened Richard. It made him impatient. He stopped pretending the marriage might recover and began discussing my future as if he were relocating an employee. A small apartment, a private medical allowance, supervised access to family events if I remained discreet. When I objected, he reminded me that the prenup limited support and claimed the penthouse, company shares, and trust distributions were untouchable. Then he said no judge would let an emotional pregnant woman interfere with a multi-billion-dollar company. That sentence restored something useful in me. Richard wanted me frightened enough to think like a discarded wife. I began thinking like an investigator. Fear did not vanish. It narrowed into focus. I stopped asking why he could be so cruel and started asking where the cruelty had been paid for, who approved it, which account disguised it, and what document he assumed I would never read. Questions saved me from panic. Each one became a small light in a room he thought he had darkened. Richard was supposed to be in London, but a receipt on his laptop showed a luxury hotel in Midtown Manhattan. Room service, champagne, gifts. Then I found more jewelry invoices, a trike, a lease. Payments to a company connected to Sloane. When I confronted him, he accused me of being unstable. The next morning, my cards were declined. The passwords were changed. His mother warned me not to embarrass the family. They thought they had trapped me. But they had not. Late one night, I went to the Sterling family archive in the basement and searched through old trust documents. After hours of digging, I found what Richard had forgotten existed, Article 12. The infidelity forfeit provision. It stated that if a Sterling heir committed documented adultery, hid marital assets, and then tried to use a prenup to financially destroy the betrayed spouse, he would lose voting control of his shares. Those shares would transfer into trust for any legitimate minor child of the marriage, with the betrayed spouse serving as sole trustee. Richard had signed the reaffirmation in 2018. He had never read the fine print, but I had. The clause alone was not enough. It required 3 conditions at once: proven adultery, concealment of marital or corporate assets, and an attempt to enforce the prenup in bad faith. Edmund had built it like a combination lock. Richard had turned every number for me. I photographed the archive pages, but I did not remove them. The next morning, a security employee loyal to Eleanor reviewed the basement log. If the file vanished, Richard would know. Instead, I returned it exactly where I found it and requested a certified copy through the trust's outside custodian, using rights granted to any current beneficiary. The custodian called me privately. Richard had requested the same file destroyed 2 weeks earlier, claiming it was obsolete. The archivist refused without trustee approval. That attempted destruction became the first evidence of bad faith. I sat on the edge of the archive table after that call with one hand pressed against my stomach. My son moved once, a slow push beneath my palm, and I whispered that I was trying, not winning, not promising, just trying. It was the first time the case stopped feeling like a fight over property and started feeling like a map out of a family that treated children as leverage before they were even born. The next day, I met Miriam Vance in a quiet diner far from Richard's world. She read the clause in silence, then looked up at me. "This is powerful," she said, "but we need proof." So I collected it. Miriam built a secure evidence room in her office. Every item entered with a date, source, and chain of custody. We assumed Richard would accuse me of fabrication because accusation had always been cheaper for him than explanation. She made me slow down. I wanted to dump every receipt on the table and watch the truth crush him. Miriam insisted truth had to be handled carefully if it was going to survive his money. We logged hotel records, copied metadata, preserved emails, and printed screenshots with source links. Every time I felt impatient, she reminded me that powerful men count on emotional evidence looking messy. We would give the court clean evidence and let Richard supply the mess. The Tribeca lease led to Kensington Creative, Sloane's company. Kensington billed sterling capital for branding consultations no department remembered receiving. The invoices were approved by Richard's private office and paid on dates matching their trips. I traced one payment through 3 subsidiaries and found it had purchased the sapphire earrings. They were separate property left to me by my grandmother, taken from a penthouse safe only Richard and I could access. Sloane wearing them turned a private insult into documented conversion. Then I found the Midtown Hotel footage. Miriam obtained it through subpoena after filing under seal. It showed Richard and Sloane entering the same suite on 7 occasions, including the night he told me a snowstorm had stranded him in London. The hidden assets were larger. Richard had moved marital investment income into a Cayman entity and labeled it a corporate reserve. He expected the prenup to shield company property, but internal emails described the account as his post-Caroline fund. Men become careless when they believe contempt is confidential. Reading those words hurt more than the affair for a moment. Post-Caroline. Not an account number. Not a neutral project name. A future built around my removal. He had reduced a marriage, a pregnancy, and 6 years of loyalty to a folder where money waited for the day he could pretend I had never mattered. I printed that email twice because my hands tore the first copy. My hardest task was acting unaware. Richard came home twice a week to collect clothes. He asked whether I had chosen a hospital and casually reminded me the company jet would no longer be available after divorce. I nodded, kept my hands on my stomach, and let him believe fear had made me small. At night, my son moved beneath my ribs while I built the timeline that would protect his future. Pregnancy made the work both harder and clearer. I slept in 90-minute pieces. I kept crackers beside stacks of subpoenas. Some nights I cried from exhaustion, then dried my face and checked another transfer. Richard had mistaken my body for evidence that I was fragile. He did not understand that carrying a child can make a woman more dangerous to anyone threatening that child's future. For 2 months, while Richard believed I was broken, I worked quietly. I traced payments to Sloane's company. I matched his business trips with her social media posts. I found the shell company that paid for her apartment. I found the invoice proving he had taken my sapphire earrings from the penthouse safe and gifted them to her. I built timelines, spreadsheets, receipts, transfers, everything. Richard thought I was crying myself to sleep. Instead, I was building the case that would expose him. Back in court, Miriam opened the black folder. Richard's legal team had filed for an expedited ruling because Sloane wanted a wedding before her supposed pregnancy became visible. That hurry prevented them from investigating why I stopped resisting. They arrived with press statements drafted and a private car waiting to take Richard directly to a celebratory lunch. Miriam began with the trust's certified history. Edmund's recorded statement explained Article 12 and the harm it was created to prevent. Then the archivist testified that Richard tried to destroy it. The judge asked his attorneys whether they had disclosed that request. Their silence changed the temperature of the room. Richard's lead attorney recovered first and argued the clause was archaic, punitive, and never intended for modern divorce. Miriam let him finish. Then she played Edmund's recorded explanation. His voice filled the courtroom, old and dry and unsentimental, describing exactly this circumstance: an heir using family wealth, concealed assets, and public humiliation to trap a pregnant spouse. Richard stared at the monitor as if his grandfather had reached out of the past and taken him by the collar. The judge asked whether Richard disputed his signature on the reaffirmation. He did not. Whether he disputed the archivist's testimony, he could not. Whether he had disclosed the attempted destruction during discovery. His attorney asked for a recess. The judge said no. Your Honor, we are invoking Article 12 of the Sterling Family Trust. Richard's attorney laughed. But Miriam placed the signed 2018 agreement before the judge. The laughter stopped. I watched Richard's lawyer reach for the document with the caution of a man touching a wire he had just realized might be live. He scanned the page, then the signature, then Richard. For the first time that morning, the expensive table on his side looked crowded, with people who had all forgotten to ask the same simple question: what exactly did he sign? Then the courtroom monitor lit up. One image showed Richard entering a hotel with Sloan. Another showed them on a private trip. Then came bank transfers, a lease, corporate expenses. Each piece of evidence landed harder than the last. Richard's face turned pale. Sloan stopped smiling. His mother, Eleanor, demanded that the screen be turned off, but the judge ordered her to sit down. Richard accused me of spying. I looked at him and said quietly, "No, Richard. I just did the math." Then Miriam revealed the second shock. The false pregnancy mattered because Richard had promised Sloan immediate trust distributions for the next sterling hair. Corporate counsel became suspicious when she refused examination by a physician approved under the trust rules. They compared the ultrasound image to a medical licensing database and found the original, published 3 years earlier, in a teaching file. Sloan had also sent a positive laboratory report. Its serial number belonged to a clinic in another state, and the patient name had been digitally replaced. When confronted privately, she claimed Richard pressured her to produce proof. Richard claimed she deceived him alone. Miriam then displayed messages showing both of them, discussing how a pregnancy announcement would influence the divorce judge and the board. Whether Richard knew the pregnancy was false from the beginning became less important than the fact that he used it as leverage without verifying it. Richard had rushed the divorce partly because Sloan claimed she was pregnant with his child. But an internal investigation, ordered by Richard's own corporate lawyers, had found that she had never been pregnant. The ultrasound images she used had come from an online medical database. The courtroom froze. Sloan turned on Richard, furious that he had investigated her. Richard looked back at her coldly and said she had lied to him. Their perfect little victory collapsed in front of everyone. The collapse was not loud at first. It was a ripple of lowered eyes and shifting papers. One of Richard's lawyers removed his glasses and cleaned them without needing to. Eleanor whispered something to a trustee who suddenly became fascinated by the floor. Sloan's hand flew to the borrowed earrings, and for the first time that morning, she looked less like a bride in waiting and more like a witness, realizing the oath would apply to her too. The judge reviewed the clause, Richard's signature, and the evidence. He recessed for 90 minutes. Richard spent the break pacing in a private corridor, while Eleanor called trustees and demanded intervention. Sloan locked herself in a restroom. I sat with Miriam and listened to my son's heartbeat through a small monitor my doctor had recommended, because stress was causing contractions. The sound was thin and rapid, like a tiny drum refusing to surrender to the noise around it. Miriam said nothing for a while. She simply sat beside me with the evidence boxes at her feet and one hand ready in case I needed help standing. In that hallway, between a billionaire's anger and a judge's ruling, the only power I cared about was the stubborn rhythm saying my child was still here. For the first time that day, I was afraid. Not of losing money, but of what the battle was costing the child I meant to protect. Miriam asked whether I wanted to request a delay. No, I said. I have delayed the truth long enough. Then he ruled. The prenup remained valid, but so did the forfeiture clause Richard had signed. Because he had committed adultery, concealed major expenses, and tried to use the court to leave me with almost nothing. Article 12 was triggered. Richard stood up in panic. "This is my company!" he shouted. The judge looked at him and said, "It was your voting control, Mr. Sterling, and you signed it away." That sentence landed with the clean force of arithmetic. Not punishment invented in anger. Not revenge hidden inside law. A condition. A signature. A consequence. Richard had spent his life believing contracts were weapons for other people. For once, one answered him. Effective immediately, Richard's voting shares were transferred into a trust for our unborn child. I was appointed sole trustee. with full voting authority until my child reached the age stated in the agreement. Richard went silent. For the first time, he understood what he had lost. It was not only money. Money had always found ways back to men like Richard. He had lost automatic belief. He had lost the room's instinct to arrange itself around his confidence. He had lost the protection that came from everyone assuming. The hair must understand the machinery better than the woman he underestimated. That loss frightened him more than the numbers. I did not pity him, but I understood the terror of meeting a boundary he could not buy. For once, Richard was not negotiating with a person trained to soothe him. He was facing the plain language of his own signature. Without voting control, he was no longer untouchable. His board could remove him. His lenders could question him. Investigators could examine everything he had tried to hide. As I stood to leave, Richard whispered, "You planned this?" I looked at him calmly. "No, Richard. You set the fire. I just refused to burn in it." The judge granted me temporary residence in the penthouse, medical coverage, legal fees, and protection of the trust assets. He also referred the suspicious corporate spending for further review. Temporary residence sounded clinical, but it meant I could return to the nursery without asking permission from the man who had locked me out of accounts. Medical coverage meant I would not have to choose doctors based on Richard's anger. Legal fees meant he could no longer bury the truth under invoices. Sometimes justice begins with practical orders that let a person breathe long enough to keep fighting. The referral uncovered more than Sloane's apartment. Richard had used company aircraft for private travel, charged personal staff to foundation programs, and moved funds between subsidiaries to inflate performance before lender reviews. Article 12 did not create those choices. It removed the control that had kept anyone from examining them. Investigators later found a second layer of records kept by an assistant Richard had fired without severance. She had saved calendars, aircraft manifests, and text messages because she feared becoming his next scapegoat. Her evidence widened the review from marital misconduct into corporate governance failure. Richard had built his authority on inherited trust, then treated that trust as a private bank. The clause did not merely punish an affair. It exposed a system that had mistaken his confidence for competence. That distinction mattered when Richard's allies accused me of orchestrating a corporate coup. I had not forged his emails. I had not billed his mistress's apartment as consulting. I had not moved money offshore and named the account after my own contempt. Power had protected him from consequences so long that consequences looked like an attack. At the board's emergency meeting, Richard insisted the court had been manipulated by a vindictive spouse. Then the audit chair read his post-Caroline Fund email aloud. Directors who had toasted him days earlier voted to suspend him pending investigation. Eleanor tried to remove me as trustee by claiming pregnancy made me medically unfit. My doctor responded with a letter stating I was healthy and that reducing harassment would be more useful than reducing responsibility. The petition was denied. Eleanor never forgave that sentence. She had spent decades translating male misconduct into female instability. If Richard betrayed me, I was emotional. If I documented it, I was obsessive. If I protected my child, I was power-hungry. My doctor's letter cut through the performance with almost surgical calm. The problem was not my pregnancy. The problem was the people using it as an argument for control. Outside the courtroom, reporters shouted questions. Their voices hit me like weather. Did I hate Richard? Was I seeking control of the company? Was the baby the real winner? Miriam guided me past most of it, but one question stayed with me because it revealed how quickly a woman defending herself becomes ambitious in the public imagination. Richard could take, conceal, and betray. I could read a clause and somehow become the dangerous one. One asked if I had known I would win. I placed a hand on my stomach and answered, I didn't know if I would win. I only knew my child deserved better than his father's contempt. 3 months later, I sat in the sunlit nursery of the Tribeca penthouse, holding my newborn son, Edmund James Sterling. I named him Edmund not to honor the fortune, but the one man in that family who understood that wealth without safeguards becomes permission. Before his death, Richard's grandfather had left a letter for the first child protected by Article 12. The trust attorney delivered it after my son's birth. I read the letter in the nursery at 3 in the morning, while my son slept against my shoulder. Edmund's handwriting slanted sharply, impatient even on paper. He apologized to a child he would never meet for the arrogance he had failed to remove from the family completely. Then he wrote that safeguards are love made legal, when character cannot be trusted to arrive on time. It said power was safest when held for someone too young to ask for it, by someone strong enough to remember it was borrowed. I framed that sentence above the nursery desk. The fallout had been swift. Sterling Capital's board removed Richard unanimously. His misuse of company funds became a public scandal. Eleanor resigned from the family foundation and disappeared from public life. Sloane tried to sell her version of the story, but her lies caught up with her. Richard sent me one message after the board removed him. "You destroyed me." I deleted it and blocked his number. I stared at those 3 words for longer than I should have. Not because I believed them, but because they were so complete in their refusal to see me. No mention of the child. No mention of Sloane. No mention of stolen earrings, hidden accounts, or court findings. In Richard's mind, accountability was something I had done to him. That was why blocking him felt less like anger than hygiene. I had not destroyed him. I had simply stopped protecting him from himself. A week later, I walked into the Sterling Capital boardroom, wearing a black suit and my grandmother's sapphire earrings, finally returned by court order. The earrings felt heavier than I remembered. Not because of the stones, but because of the insult they had survived. Sloane had worn them as proof that Richard could take even my history and hand it to someone else. When I fastened them that morning, I did not feel glamorous. I felt restored. Some objects are not valuable because they glitter. They are valuable because they return with your name still attached. I did not become chief executive. Trusteeship gave me voting authority, not automatic wisdom. My first motion created an independent ethics committee and barred family members from approving expenses involving relatives or romantic partners. My second protected whistleblowers. My third commissioned a full review of foundation grants Eleanor had treated as social favors. Those motions were not glamorous. They were not the kind of victory people imagine after a courtroom reversal. But they mattered because they changed what the next powerful person could get away with. Richard had assumed the company existed to absorb his appetites. I wanted records that would make such appetite visible early, while stopping it still looked boring. Some directors resented me, others underestimated me. That was familiar territory. The first board packet I prepared was thicker than Richard's usual glossy summaries and much less flattering. I asked for real risk reports, not reputation management. I asked why complaints from junior staff died in human resources. I asked why every family expenditure carried urgency, while employee safety requests waited for quarterly review. The room learned quickly that I was not there to decorate the head seat. Richard attended one meeting by video as a non-voting shareholder. When he saw me in his former seat, his face tightened. "You always wanted this," he said. "No," I answered. "I wanted a faithful husband and a safe pregnancy. This is what remained after you made those impossible." Then I muted his line and continued the agenda. The room went quiet. Every director stood. I knew better than to mistake that standing for loyalty. Some rose out of respect, some out of calculation, some because the cameras in the lobby had made cowardice expensive. It did not matter. I did not need their devotion. I needed their votes, their records, and their compliance with rules Richard had spent years treating as optional. Not for Richard's discarded wife. Not for the quiet woman they thought they could underestimate. They stood for the trustee. For the mother of the heir. For the woman who had read the fine print. I sat at the head of the table, opened the first agenda packet, and smiled. The smile was not victory over Richard. It was recognition of myself. I had entered that family as someone they could underestimate. I left that morning as someone they had to record in the minutes. "Gentlemen," I said, "let's begin." Richard believed the overlooked clause took his future. The truth was simpler. The clause only made sure the future belonged to the child he had tried to leave with nothing. I never wanted my son to inherit a throne built from fear. I wanted him to inherit proof that power can be restrained before it becomes family tradition. Years from now, my son may read the record and wonder whether his first inheritance was a courtroom battle. I hope he sees something different. I hope he sees that before he could speak, someone chose to protect him from becoming another bargaining chip in a family that confused money with destiny. I hope he learns that fine print matters, but so does the courage to use it when love has been turned into a threat. If you know someone who needs to hear this, share this video with them. Thank you for being here. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.